Hello and welcome to Rwanda Broadcasting Agency. Though global headwinds are slowing economies and we have been experiencing high unemployment and elevated inflationary pressures around the world and limited fiscal space compounding from the challenges that are coming from the scars that were caused by the pandemic and climate related events. The government of Rwanda, the Rwandan Authority, have been implementing a sizable policy package to protect the most vulnerable against multiple shocks while steering the economy to protect the macroeconomic stability and advance their reform agenda under policy coordination instrument. In studio here we have Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Thank you very much for honoring the invitation of RBA.
Thank you for having me.
Straightforward, the developing economies like Rwanda and other African countries have been facing a lot of shocks, various shocks, bien sûr. And such shocks are coming from the effects of COVID-19 and Russia's war on Ukraine. And they are also facing different problems that are coming from the climate calamities. So these problems are causing the economies and economic management to be very hard at the same time. Yet the poverty levels are projected to rise significantly, and some economies are in very challenging situations. How can such countries tackle pressing issues while at the same time continue to invest in priorities, and how is IMF going to facilitate that?
It has been indeed a very difficult time for the world economy. We have experienced two unthinkable events. COVID bringing our world economy to a standstill for a prolonged period of time, and then the war Russia started in Ukraine that has pushed prices, especially of energy and food, up, causing inflation to accelerate, and as a result, putting pressure on central banks to tighten financial conditions to increase interest rates. In this environment, we see 2023 to be yet another difficult year. Growth will decelerate even further. That affects all countries, but it affects low-income countries particularly hard. Why? Because on top of all the other pressures, they experience three things. One, depreciation of their currencies. With the Federal Reserve in the United States, the European Central Bank in Frankfurt tightening interest rates, that translates into their currencies appreciating against the currencies of developing economies. Two, very limited fiscal space. It was exhausted by COVID, and now it is being affected even further. Three, in a number of countries, the level of debt has gone up. Rwanda is a bright spot because Rwanda has managed access to external financial resources very carefully, primarily relying on grants and highly concessional loans. And while the level of borrowing in Rwanda also went up, it does not have the same impact on the fiscal position of the country because it is much cheaper to serve the external commitments here. I'm coming from Zambia, a country where the debt pressures are much more severe. Zambia defaulted on its debt and now is in a process of negotiations with creditors. I do hope that these negotiations will be successful. But I want to finish on a point that makes Rwanda and Zambia both a good example. Governance, commitment to reforms, commitment to fighting corruption, to making sure that public finances are clean. And that commitment matters tremendously. To finish back going to COVID, what happened during the COVID was people with strong immune systems were less likely to get sick, and when they get sick, much less likely to die. Similarly, economies with strong fundamentals, where taxes are collected, public spending is well prioritized, and there is space for private sector to invest to create jobs, these countries also withstand shocks much better. Our engagement with Rwanda is exactly in this area, how to make the country even more resilient to shocks to come, and they will. Among those are the climate shocks that the country is already experiencing. We have created at the IMF a new instrument. Never before in our history we had long-term financing for structural transformation. Now we do. $40 billion made available to our members to support climate resilient, low carbon growth. And Rwanda, I am very pleased to say, is the first country in Africa to get access to this instrument on the basis of its strong macroeconomic performance and on the basis of having already defined clear objectives, how dealing with the climate crisis can help Rwanda to have a better performing agricultural sector and better protection of people against these shocks.
Yeah, so you have tackled on a very important issue. Through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, the IMF has shown the will to actively play a role in helping countries tackling long-term challenges, such as climate change mitigation. But Africa is almost an insignificant contributor to carbon emissions. Yet it's bearing the full brunt of climate change. So here, I'm just asking myself, if we are to help Africa, as you know, the environment in Africa, the economies in Africa are based on agriculture. And these challenges are affecting the agricultural output. So how will IMF help Africa to deal with the impact that climate change is having on its impact on, especially on agriculture?
You're absolutely right. Africa has done almost nothing to create the problem the world is facing, but it is suffering tremendous consequences. And our work with African countries, including in Rwanda, concentrates exactly on this question. How can we support policies that would make agriculture more resilient to shocks, use of water resources more efficient, more effective, and how we can connect adaptation to climate change with the mitigation efforts of the planet. In Africa, including in Rwanda, reforestation and addressing land degradation answers both questions. It makes the country more resilient, but it also creates sinks for carbon, so the world can benefit. Not only Africa would benefit, not only Rwanda would benefit, but the whole world would benefit. And if I may, we also have to pursue access to clean energy in Africa, because let's remember there are 600 million people in Africa with no access to electricity. We don't want them to have to go to the fuels that the world wants to abandon. But for that, African countries need to be helped with technology transfer and financing so they can generate clean energy. Here I see fantastic signs of using solar, thinking through access to electricity in a way that is compatible with climate change. Because if you don't get people to have access to clean energy, they plant trees with one hand, they chop them with the other, because they need fuel, they need energy, they need to have access to what energy means for development.
Let's go to the African content of free trade area. We do agree that it is supposed to boost the intra-Africa trade, but we just want to know the role of IMF to make sure that this dream is becoming a reality, because they are facing a lot of challenges to implement this.
We recognize that the world is at a very critical junction. Not just Africa, globally, there are forces of fragmentation, and we see global trade slowing down. This is very dangerous for the world economy. We run a study that says if the adjustment to supply chain security, which is a necessity, is done well, it would cost only 0.2% of global GDP. If it is done badly, it would cost 7% of global GDP. This is $7 trillion wiped out. We want to see attention to trade and Africa benefiting from diversification of supply chains. In other words, more things being produced in Africa. We also want to see the Continental Free Trade Agreement delivering on its promise. For a country like Rwanda that is landlocked, it's so important this happens. It's a small country. In its economy of scale, it needs to trade more. What does that require? It requires continuous work on trade agreements, removing barriers, both tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers to trade. It requires investment in infrastructure so goods can travel across Africa. It requires more attractiveness in Africa to private investments from the rest of the world. I mean, the world is full of money. Liquidity is huge, but money finds it hard to walk its way to Africa. So what is the role of the IMF? Help the African countries to have those strong fundamentals I talked about, so they become more attractive to bring more financial resources to increase production, more attractive to be part of the global value chains, and of course more able to trade with each other.
We really thank you very much, Kristalina Georgieva, for your time with RBA, and we thank you very much for accepting to talk to us.
Thank you.